Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor William Fuchs, who is Professor of Finance at the University of Texas. His research focuses on situations with a poor contractual environment due to asymmetric information or lack of formal enforcement. He studies how repeated interactions or policies can be used to partially overcome the underlying frictions. Welcome, Bill.
Hi, welcome.
Yeah, so thanks for doing this. So the topic of our conversation today is the paper that you have entitled Optimal Arrangements for Distribution in Developing Markets, Theory and Evidence, in which you say large literature examines demand-side barriers to product adoption. And in this paper, you examine supply-side barriers in a setting with a limited contract enforcement. And I know that you have a field study here from Uganda, but before we get into the details of that, could you talk a bit about the motivation of this and why supply-side barriers exist, especially in developing markets?
Yes, so actually this is kind of an interesting story to how this paper came about that helps explain this to some extent, which is one of the co-authors. So this is joint work with Brett Green and David Levine. And so David had done some prior work in Uganda where basically they studied sort of the demand side of the problem. What they did is they went house to house. They were sort of pretending themselves to be the salespersons, and they were doing this with these more efficient cook stoves that burn less, need less fuel and are also cleaner. And so basically, what they studied in their prior work was how offering a payment with installments and the right to return the good if the consumers didn't like it, how that increased adoption significantly. Okay? Yeah. So he told us about this, and he had some ideas. Wanted to do this more broadly outside. So his work was in Kampala, the capital of Uganda, and he wanted to do some work on the countryside. And he faced a lot of problems of actually how to pretend to be the salesperson, how to manage a team, etc., to go and do this work. Yeah. And so he mentioned this to Brett and I, and we started thinking about it, and then we realized that there's sort of this interesting problem and this interesting question is if this was so profitable as David had seemed to uncover in his study, right? If this were such a good thing to do, to offer credit and the right to return, why is it that vendors are not doing it themselves?
Yeah.
And basically part of the issue is that if you think about it, especially once you go to rural areas, the vendor, right, the salesperson is really not very different than any other person in the village, and they don't have deep pockets. So in the same way that the random villager cannot afford to buy these things up front because they don't have enough cash, the salesperson also doesn't have enough working capital to provide credit and collect over time.
So the cost of distribution, there is nobody to really step in and do the distribution.
No, so there's there's two issues also when you think about. This has to do more with the fact that the local person doesn't have these deep pockets to be able to provide credit themselves. So and so that's kind of the friction on the supply side, that I cannot supply this credit, and I cannot maybe allow the person to have the right return because I cannot afford the risk that might be embedded in that for myself. And so then you think about, okay, what about somebody maybe from the city doing this? And then the problem is obviously they have to deal with the distance, with a lack of local knowledge, and somehow they have to incentivize an employee to do this work for them. So that's one side of the motivation for this project, is to see, okay, if we were, and we partnered actually with BRAC, which is a large nonprofit, and BRAC had these thing they call community health providers. So it's all women actually, and what they did is they sold low ticket items, some hygiene products, maybe malaria pills, and small things like that. And the idea was try to see if we could use this network of people and some better contracts to start selling larger ticket items that could have big value for the consumers, for the villagers. So examples of that are these efficient cook stoves or the solar power lights like we used in the experiment.
So I want to understand this, Will. So is the problem that the supplier does not have sufficient financial backing nor have access to credit lines, and hence they can't really supply it to the consumer?
Well, they could supply it on a cash basis, right? So if I'm a local villager, and I run the local shop, right, these community health providers, they might be able to buy, one solar light at a time and sell it. And once they get paid in full, they can go and buy another one. But they cannot sell 5 solar lights with credit because they don't have the money to provide, in a sense, that credit. They need the cash up front to buy the lights. So the idea is maybe we can provide credit, working capital to these vendors, and with a hope that they would then be able to sell with credit. And we sort of instructed them to try to do that. And that way sort of create a credit chain, right? By where we would give credit. We were pretending to be like the big city supplier. And so we would give credit to the small retailer in the villages and hope that this small retailer would then give credit to the final consumer. That was kind of the idea.
So the vendors here are intermediaries, and it's because they don't have access to credit, they can't really scale up. They have to go one by one sort of thing. But why wouldn't the manufacturer go direct to consumer in this market?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that it's sort of hard to have that reach, and then if you were the manufacturer, then you have to worry about the incentives and worry about collecting, and it's not that easy to there's no enforcement or very little sort of formal enforcement you can do, and so it's not easy if some firm in Kampala wants to sell lights in a rural place. How do they get things to get paid and collect and all of those things? There's a big advantage of having a local person sort of doing this work for them.
But if you say the local person, the vendor himself or herself is sort of similar to the consumer, Uh, would that, how does that enhance the sort of the contract enforcement for the manufacturer?
Well, okay, so here's the key. So the manufacturer, so even though the manufacturer has like a one-time relationship, if it were directly to deal with clients, right? Think of the client, it would be very infrequent relationship versus it would have a very frequent relationship with the intermediary because the intermediary is selling all the lights. So, so the whole point of sort of our paper, and we have a big theoretical side to our work, is how can you design an incentive scheme, a working arrangement between the manufacturer and the local vendor, so that the local vendor actually has incentives to repay its debts and to use the working capital wisely and not just run away, which is the big consideration here.
So structurally, the manufacturer needs the vendors, but unfortunately, the vendors are not in a position to really scale up. They don't have access to credit lines and so on. So it is inefficient in terms of getting the product to the consumer, right? So the paper is about sort of having some kind of a contractual and financial solution to it.
Yes, basically what we propose is, and we find a relatively simple arrangement, which is the manufacturer essentially has to give something that looks like working capital. So basically, I'm providing the lights in advance, and I'm not asking for any payment in advance, which obviously it exposes the manufacturer to the threat that these local vendors just run away. But that's also, but that's why is it that these guys are not supposed to run away, is because there's sort of a promise that you can grow with me and make more future profits if you don't run away. And so that growth opportunity is what's sort of supposed to discipline the relationship. So I don't want to run away because I know that, today I sell one light, but I come back, I can use those profits, I reinvest, tomorrow I can sell two, and so on. And then over time, I'm going to be able to make more money. And that's what's more tempting than just running away today with one light or two lights to start with.
Yeah, so that's so interesting. So, the fundamental issue here is that in a developing market, you don't have contract enforcement. So essentially, you have to come up with a way to do this and reduce the probability that the intermediary takes advantage of you or run away from it. And so, do you want to talk about the Uganda field study and talk about exactly what?
Yes. So basically, what we did is we used solar lights, as I was alluding to before, as our sort of expensive good that we were going to test the theory with. And so the idea is these lights cost about $25 or so.
These are solar.
These are
lights?
solar power lights. So it's basically a small solar panel, maybe 10 inches square or something like that, and then a one single light. That's what we use for our experiment. Actually, it was interesting as a learning experience for myself, is that when we were testing or asking the potential clients and vendors what type of lights they wanted and what was in demand, it turned out that another important feature is that the lights we used could charge cell phones. Okay, so these local villagers don't have electricity, but in many cases, actually, they have cell phones, and they actually have to walk sometimes for an hour or so into a town to be able to charge their phone and pay for that. So having the light also charge their phones was an additional value. And what's remarkable is the economics of this. Right, because what basically we're replacing is a kerosene lantern, and so your average household's spending at the time about $1.50 to $2 on just a week on kerosene for the lantern, in addition to potentially some money to charge a cell phone, and this light that replaces that, right, costs about $25. Okay, so in about 10 to 12 weeks, you pay for the light, and then the light lasts about 2 years. Slowly the battery starts degrading, but you have about 2 years worth of the product. So it's a huge return on investment. Okay, the problem is that most households don't have those $25, to make the upfront payment. Okay, so what we did in the experiment is we contracted with these vendors that were part of the BRAC network, and then we randomized, and basically we did 3 orthogonal randomizations. So one of the randomizations was whether we were giving credit or not. Okay, so we would give it an initial couple of lights as credit, as initial working capital, or we were just offering them cash as sort of business as usual. Then the other randomization was we were giving the vendors themselves the right to return any unsold inventory. We wanted to take sort of the risk away from them if that was an issue. And then the third treatment that we also considered was giving them like an extra light. So you can think of this as almost like a little bit extra credit, if you will. But this extra light, we instructed them specifically to use it as a sales mechanism, as a loaner light. So the idea is that they would go to a household with the light charge, leave it for one evening or something like that, and then try to make the sale the next day. It's kind of a sample product. And so then we tested we saw over time how these different groups of salespeople did, and obviously we had a control group which is just business as usual, no credit, and no right to return, and no loaner or experimental light. And so basically, we're in the control group, we only got around one light worth of sales. Okay, so they basically bought the first light, maybe 2 lights, and that was it. Once those that got credit, an initial credit, were around 7 lights that they were selling. And once you introduce the credit plus the loaner light, we were up to close to 16, 17 lights. Okay, so it's a huge, and these are statistically significant differences. It turns out that the right to return didn't matter too much, but the other two mattered quite a bit. So you go from about 1 to 2 lights to around 16, 17 lights. So it's a huge impact in terms of sales that you can have by offering this more efficient contract.
Yeah, so this is a situation where the supply chain is really choked because of capital constraints. But I wondered, Will, if so, this is a market failure. If this is well understood, couldn't the government step in and correct this failure?
It's not that easy. I mean, I guess the government could try to do some lending schemes, right? Some credit schemes. I mean, that could be more useful for other things as well. But that always has its own, problems or difficulties. What's interesting is actually there's some pretty recent developments. We found out some of these as actually we were finishing writing our paper, of firms that are using new technology as a way to sort of circumvent some of the problems. So in particular, this is now, as cell phone technology is getting cheaper and cheaper, and there's more penetration of cell phones, there's firms that implement what I would call a pay-as-you-go system. So basically, what they can do is they can essentially remotely shut off your light. Okay, so this is very similar now to think about like a utility in the US, right? So suppose you don't pay your electricity bill, it gets cut off, right? So this is similar in the sense that, if you don't pay your weekly installment for the solar lights or the solar panels, then they basically, you cannot use it, right? They have a way to, electronically disable the system so that if you don't pay, you don't get any use out of it. So, and I think these companies are being actually quite successful. And their systems they usually use are a bit more expensive because you have to justify this extra technology. So they're slightly larger systems, but they're having success. And again, the key to the success is finding a smart way to overcome this temptation to default, right? So now if you default and you don't pay on the system, you really get nothing in return.
Yeah, sort of a financial intermediation, right? So I was thinking it costs $25. The cost of the alternative is $1.50 per week. So, like you say, in 3 months you get your money back. So you could have a system where suppose you sell this at $1 per week. From the consumer's perspective, it is really good, right? They're saving 50 cents per week, but you're going to get it paid off in 5-6 months, and from that point on, you have free cash flow.
Yeah. That's in a sense that's the basis of our idea is that indeed what we told the vendors is, look, charge the final consumer basically the $1.50 that they were supposed to spend on kerosene this week. Just tell them, that money that you're going to save, instead of spending it in kerosene, give it back to me, and pay it to me as an installment for the system.
So I was just thinking that the problem appears very intuitive. The solution appears very intuitive. There appears to be different ways to solve this problem. Physical intermediaries getting credits, or some sort of financial intermediary that works like a utility. So given that this information is there, why hasn't it happened? Is there some sort of an information gap? Do the consumers know such products exist in the market?
Well, that's also an important issue. Consumers, I think they're not familiar, at least with the solar lights. At the time we were doing this project, they were not very familiar with it. Like, for example, one of the big issues with the kerosene lanterns, right, is the risk of fire, right? They're a hot thing, right? They're powered by a flame. So one of the things that the consumers were extremely surprised is that when we were doing the demonstrations and somebody would touch the light and it's cold or relatively cold, they were like they couldn't believe it. So certainly they don't know, they're not familiar with the product. Another important problem is that there's a lot of sort of fake products, a lot of crappy imitation type products. So a lot of things are being sold that are supposed to be solar power lights, but they're anything but that. And so, for example, it's kind of an interesting anecdote. And for some reason, the Chinese products are believed to be bad in particular, and this is at least in Uganda. So it's kind of funny because the box, where of the light, where we were working with Barefoot Power, and the boxes of their lights, have very prominently, it says designed in Australia, and then it says made in PRC, very small, rather than China. They say PRC, right, for People's Republic of China. And this is a problem that the World Bank is also very conscious about. So they know this is a big issue. And there was an effort at the time, I don't know how successful this has been, but there was an effort at the time of trying to sort of certify the quality of some of these goods, right? In the same way we put credit ratings to companies, right? Trying to have some sort of credit rating or, quality rating for solar lights, especially, in operation in the field, a seal of approval. but again, the imitators, the fakers are always, obviously trying to fake the seal of approval as well. So it's not an easy thing to do, and reputation is very important. So I think one of the reasons we didn't face as much problem with this is because we were working with BRAC, and so their community health providers trusted BRAC, so they knew we were not giving them fake products to sell. But I think in reality, if you want to just show up in the market and nobody knows you, I think that would be an important barrier to overcome as well.
Yeah. So you have a model, Will, in the paper. You talk about an NGO stepping into this market and what could be the NGO strategy with the vendor in a multi-period game. You want to talk a bit about what you do?
Yes. So one thing that's interesting. So in the paper, we show that a lot of our analysis is thinking of a credit maximizing firm. So if I'm the distributor from the big town, I just want to maximize my profits. But it turns out that the problem is isomorphic, is essentially the same. If you think about an NGO that just wants to do good and assume that doing good is maximizing adoption, right? So if I have the objective to maximize adoption, and I have a fixed budget, right? Let's say I have $1 million for this to try to get as many solar lights as I can in the field. What we point out is that you might actually be better off using sort of this market mechanism, providing credit. So maybe subsidize the solar lights. I'm not, you might need to subsidize them a bit, or but try to collect at least some of the money back, and because that's gonna make your dollars go further than if you simply use your $1 million to buy 40,000 lights or whatever the right accounting is, and just sort of give them out for free in the market. And furthermore, actually, I think using sort of a more market-based mechanism, and at least trying to collect some money from the final consumers, has two benefits. Not only you're going to reach more consumers eventually, also there's a problem in a lot of markets in Africa. So, for example, the market for mosquito nets is completely screwed up because people have come to expect that every so often some NGO will come with free bed nets. So nobody wants to, be a bed net salesperson or a bed net repairman, or because basically the market got really distorted by the presence of these NGOs that give bed nets for free. So that's a bit of a problem, especially when you think about a market that maybe needs to have repairs and things like that, like the solar lights. Another problem is, or another thing that at least you hear stories about this. I don't know for a fact how big of a problem this is. I don't know if somebody has measured it correctly, but for example, with the bed nets, you hear stories of people using the bed nets as fishing nets or decoration rather than actual bed nets, mosquito bed nets, right? Because the product is given for free, and so it's kind of random if you get it or not. And then you basically sometimes have people that don't really need it or don't really want it for that use if they get the product. Whereas if you have to actually pay something for the product, even if it's subsidized, but you have to pay a positive amount for it, then you would get the people that are more likely to actually use it for its intended use, to use the product, to buy the product in the first place. So I think there's some value in trying to use this sort of more market-based mechanism as well.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point, right? So going back to the light problem, the issue there is the intermediaries are not really developed. They're not financially capable. And so if you have any situation where an NGO is dumping product at zero cost, then you won't be able to create a robust intermediary at any point because they will have no incentive to enter this market and build up business.
No, indeed,
right?
that's I think an issue, and when we were talking with when we were in discussions with BRAC and thinking about which products we would choose, they basically told us, no, let's not do solar lights because we won't get the vendors to want to carry that and have inventory in that and things like that because of these problems.
And I guess the vendors get conditioned. So the mosquito nets. I know that there were many foundations active in Africa with mosquito nets, and if they occasionally go in and dump mosquito nets at zero cost, you won't get the sort of the broad adoption that you're looking for, right? And so I suspect this is happening in many markets.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you have enough money to cover the market for completely, it's okay. But if if it's in this intermediate point where it's large enough that you come to distort the market, but not large enough to cover the whole market, it can sort of stifle the local entrepreneurs from sort of providing that, and that can be in the long run somewhat problematic, I think.
Yeah, and the other thing that you talk about in the paper I found very interesting is that because of lack of contracts and enforcement, the NGO's optimum strategy appears to be it's a multi-period game. So the vendors have to sort of have a long-term profit expectation from playing the game. So if I understand this correctly, well, the optimum strategy appears to be sort of start slow and
yes.
build up.
So the idea is, again, you're trying to entice the vendors from not walking away, and the way to sort of entice them is with future growth, and also, and the reason to start small is that if you realize, look, think of it this way. The easiest way to think about it is there's some pie to be made in this market, right? So if we go to village A, we can in the long run make so much money, right? Now, the size of the pie is going to be larger the faster we can cover the market, right? So if we start larger, the pie is going to be bigger, right? In present terms, we're going to be able to cover the whole market faster, so we're going to make a bigger pie. Okay, so that's kind of an incentive to start larger rather than smaller. Is if I give you more credit today, we can cover the whole market sooner. We're going to recover the profit sooner. So that's a bigger return or bigger net present value, if you will. So a bigger pie. Now, but counter to that or weighting against that is the fact that you have to realize that whatever I'm giving you or I'm giving the vendor as initial credit, right? Whatever initial amount of lights I give that vendor, that's essentially money this vendor can walk away with, right? So if I'm starting bigger, that means that the share of the surplus that goes to this local vendor has to be larger. And so there's kind of this trade-off from the perspective of the big firm of, okay, I can have a bigger pie, but then I'm going to have a smaller share of the bigger pie. So partly the decision of how large to start has to do with that trade-off. There's an additional benefit. We haven't molded explicitly in the paper, but there's an additional benefit of starting small, which is, if you think about it, there can be some heterogeneity in terms of the vendors. So there can be some, and again, this was not a big issue for us because we already had some sort of relationship with these vendors through BRAC. But if you think about randomly recruiting vendors, right, there's some chance that you get some sort of crooks they're literally for just trying to make the fast dollar. And so by starting small, you also have the ability to potentially sort of separate these two groups, and hopefully, some of those that are going to steal from you, okay, they'll steal, but they'll just go away quick, and you won't lose as much as if you had started large with everybody. So there's also this sort of testing the waters kind of thing that's an advantage from starting small too.
Yeah, so when you have a lot of uncertainty, you can essentially get information by running multiple experiments as well, right? I know that you have other similar studies going on in Latin America, and you haven't written papers around that yet. You want to talk a bit about what you're finding in Latin America?
Well, we don't have findings yet. We were actually we were running our study when we got hit by the COVID, so we had to put everything on hold, and we just relaunched it. But basically, we're studying a somewhat related theme, which has to do with repeated credit and access to credit. And so we're working with a bank in Bolivia, for example, and we're studying two things with them. One is we're trying to motivate better repayment by offering the access to better credit terms in the future. And then we also want to study with them the complementarities between credit and training. So we want to, we're going to train and provide some sort of training services to part of the clients, and try to see, how that impacts the firms and the the repayments that they subsequently make. And again, the spirit is similar in that in the case in Uganda, in the sense that what I would like to do with these studies is find things that are self-sustaining, profitable. I want to be able to show, if it works, maybe it doesn't, but if it works, I would like to show, this bank or other banks, ways in which you can improve the business with sort of win-wins that don't need subsidies, right? So if we can find things, if it's worth training your clients, right, you should do it, right? One thing that's sort of interesting, there's a lot of papers in economics that study, the impact of training and stuff on firm outcomes. And one of the questions is, is it a good return for investment, right? Would a firm like a bank, especially if there are important complementarities, want to set up trainings, and would that be sort of profitable for them to do? So that's part of the spirit of the question.
Yeah, the idea that things have to be self-sustaining appears to be very important, right? So when NGOs think about these problems, when governments or private-public partnerships, there appear to be some sort of an optimum strategy that is really focused on self-sustenance rather than just sort of tactically solve the problem by dumping products at zero cost.
Yeah, again, I think there might be instances where the dumping strategy could be good, but especially if you think about situations that have a huge scale, right? I mean, we have such a large fraction of the developing world that depend on kerosene lanterns, for example, or inefficient cook stoves. That I think if we want to solve a lot of these problems, we need to figure ways in which we can get private firms to do this in a way, again, that's not terribly costly, that it's, some small profits can be made so that they fill this void. And so that's, that's my hope. Obviously, there's clearly always going to be roles for NGOs to do stuff, and, and I think also showing the way, right? So if you could study or, introduce people to these new products, it's very hard to start and enter a new market with a brand new product. So I think there's obviously a lot of roles for NGOs to play anyway. But I think there's potentially more efficient ways for them to, succeed in their mission than some of the things we see out there.
Yeah, so I want to close with, I want to get your perspective on this. So in the paper, you say it's slightly dated data, but it is roughly the same. The International Energy Agency reports that over 1.3 billion people lack access to electricity from 2011, this data. and 2.7 billion cook over an open flame, 2.7 billion. And you say the negative health impacts are sobering. United Nations Development Program and World Health Organization report that 1.6 million deaths per year in developing countries are caused by the indoor air pollution attributed to traditional fuels. So, I mean, this is not a small problem, and it appears that it's pretty well known, and it's a large problem. So in conclusion, well, if you take a problem like that, how do you think the world could solve something like this? What would be the best way to approach this?
Well, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of people working on this, and a lot of people coming up with different ideas or ways to attack it, and also I don't think there's sort of necessarily one unique solution. Another thing you realize is that there's a lot of idiosyncrasies, right? So what might work in one country might not work in another. There's a lot of entrenched interest in some case. Somebody's selling the kerosene today, right? So if you're going to displace that person, that's something to be worried about, right? Who's doing that, for example? But as you say, the problem is sobering. So one statistic actually that always stuck with me when I was stark, it was really stark when I read it, was that especially children, indoor air pollution is a very big problem, and children and women are the most affected, and they estimate that it's like smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. So it's something that really needs to be improved. And again, sometimes it comes from better design, right? So coming up with better products, be it like these more efficient cook stoves, these solar lights that keep on getting better and better, right? So the economics are improving on a lot of these products. New technology like having this ability to have a kill switch opens new sort of business plans, if you will, ways to do business. And I think you have also to think about the role of the government, how they embrace new technologies, how they embrace new ways of doing business. Like, for example, in the US, if you thought about giving me credit based on paying my utility bill, right? That's not something that would be seen as kosher, right? I mean, you wouldn't want to have people be shut off of their electricity because they didn't repay some loan. It might be hard to get that through. I think in some places, some places might be legal, some places not. And to a large extent, this is how this is working with these pay-as-you-go systems. And it's also interesting that you can sort of repurpose the collateral, right? Once you paid for the system, you maybe can get another loan based on that right, and really use this collateral for future things and more investments. But I think it'll take a combination of new products, new ways to do business. There's clearly a role for the government, try to control the fake products, inform the consumers, right? Getting the consumers to understand that these products are good and that they work. It's a difficult problem. We're just tackling a small part of it.
And the connection to healthcare costs. So whoever is holding the healthcare costs downstream has a great incentive to proactively intervene in situations like this, right? And I think that entity is likely the government.
Yes, although a lot of these. Unfortunately, a lot of these rural consumers in poor countries don't get, necessarily much in terms of public health care, right? So, if some of these kids grow up to get lung cancer, it's not like they're going to really get great treatment for it. And so we really want to avoid that from the start. And that also opens another issue that I think is worth pointing out, which is, even the consumers sometimes are not that aware of the health ramifications and the health consequences, right? So will you understand as a rural Ugandan that 20 years down the line you had this problem because you were cooking on an open flame when you were young? It's not that obvious, and for example, that was not something we stressed as much when we were selling the lights, because we realized that was something they were not internalizing. They could relate to the fires and the risk of having their family burn. Obviously, that's very present, but something that's sort of slow building, it's much harder to convey the urgency of change in some sense.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, this has been
Thank you,
great,
Jill. It was my
Thanks
pleasure.
so much for spending time with me.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.